to our virtual author event with Terry O'Reilly. Terry's going to be talking about his latest book, My Best Mistake, Epic Fails and Silver Linings. Before we start, I want to read our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis people were and still are the keepers and caretakers of the land and waters upon which the town of Gravenhurst now sits, which is covered by the Williams Treaty and the One Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We are deeply grateful for the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples who have shaped and strengthened this community for the benefit of future generations, and we are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. My name is Julia Reinhardt. I am the CEO, Chief Librarian of the Gravenhurst Public Library, and I'm very excited to be able to provide all of you with an introduction of our very special guest, Terry O'Reilly, and his latest book, My Best Mistake. Terry, who many of you know as the host of CBC's Under the Influence, was also an award-winning writer at some of Canada's top advertising agencies. He created campaigns for top brands such as Labatt, Bell, Nissan, and the Hudson's Bay Company. He is also responsible for co-founding Pirate Radio and Television with 8 recording studios in Toronto and New York City. He has been given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Advertising Design Club of Canada and has been granted honorary degrees from 3 Canadian universities. He has written 3 books, The Age of Persuasion, This I Know, Marketing Lessons from Under the Influence, and his latest book, which was launched in October, My Best Mistake. He has a wonderful wife and 3 lovely daughters who like some of his work. Welcome, Terry. So great to have
Julia.
you.
Well, hi. Hello, and thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You're so welcome. Thank you. It's quite a privilege to have you on. As I mentioned earlier on, yesterday, when we were doing this as a prequel, quite loved your show and really enjoyed your book.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. So can you tell us a bit about your new book and what it's all about?
Yeah. So if you've listened to my radio show or our podcast, you'll know that I'm endlessly fascinated by brilliant solutions to really, really difficult problems. I cannot get enough of that kind of thing. I'm always hunting for stories like that. So this book kind of came out of that fascination. I wanted to chase 2 kinds of mistakes. The first being the catastrophic career mistake, where somebody has lost their revenue, their job, and in most cases, their credibility, thinking that their career was over. And it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to them. And then the second mistake I chased was the opposite of that, which was the tiny, almost insignificant mistake that people made that they didn't even notice they made it. It was so small. And that ended up being the best thing that ever happened to them. And I was looking for stories where people really, their life really changed as a result of the mistake in big, big ways. So that was really the core of the book.
Right. So how did you come up with that concept for the book? You probably covered it a bit there, but.
Yeah, it was really kind of an offshoot of the radio show, because often I would tell stories about how products were developed where it was either a mistake or accidental. Although I didn't go into the accidental world in this book, I was really after mistakes, but how amazing things can happen as a result of a mistake. And that there are, in fact, there are meaningful mistakes in our lives, that where you think, it's the worst thing that's ever happened to you, but in fact, there's something wonderful about it, that you can find an opportunity inside it. So that has always fascinated me.
So was there one story in particular that really stood out for you when you were writing the book?
The first chapter was almost where I started with the book, and it's the chapter on Jaws, the movie. And so it's a great story because Steven Spielberg was only 28 years old when he directed that film. It was his first big shot at the big time. And because he was young and had lots of bravado, he wanted to shoot in the ocean with life-size sharks. He didn't want to shoot in Hollywood with miniatures, which a lot of movies do when they're dealing with something like this. So he insisted on building three, not just one, but three life-size animatronic sharks. So he wanted the eyes to move. He wanted the gill slits to breathe. He wanted the jaws to work. He wanted them to be really precise and accurate. So he found somebody to build three sharks. And then they moved the whole production to Martha's Vineyard chosen very specifically because the 25 or 30 feet out, or actually, let me back up, a couple of miles out, the water was really shallow, like 30 feet, even if you went out a mile or two. So in other words, it was manageable to shoot in. And he put the sharks in the water, and they had tested the sharks back in Hollywood in big water tanks, and they worked fine. But when he put them in the ocean, they malfunctioned almost immediately. None of the animatronics worked. The pneumatic hoses stopped working and sprung leaks, and all three of them sank to the bottom instantly. So you have to imagine his panic in that moment. A young director, first big shot at the big time. He's on location with his crew, with his cast, and the star of the script isn't working. So he went into his hotel room one night, panicking, sat in the dark, and asked himself one interesting question. He said, how would Hitchcock handle this? And when he recalibrated his thinking that way, he realized that what we can't see is the most terrifying thing of all. So, of course, he rewrote the whole script by not showing the shark. But if you remember how that was done in the film, which was so brilliant, you'd see a dorsal fin and a tail fin moving through the water. You couldn't see what connected them, but it gave you the sense of it. There was a scene where he used big yellow barrels that were attached to the shark that would surge through the water. So you got a sense of how powerful the shark was. Then, of course, there were John Williams' amazing score. That one of the best movie scores of all, where it would intensify as the shark came closer to you, and then it would diminish as the shark swam away. But the mistake, I think everybody knows that story. Everybody knows the shark didn't work. But not many people know the mistake Spielberg made. And the mistake was he didn't test the sharks out in salt water. So the salt water corroded all the animatronics and all the machinery and all the pneumatic hoses. That was the mistake. But as it turns out, as I say, as the last sentence in that chapter, Spielberg believes that the malfunctioning shark added $175 million to the box office.
Oh, wow.
Best thing that ever happened to him.
For sure. That's amazing story. And I think, yeah, like you said, the way you described it with the yellow barrels, I remember those scenes very distinctly. And I remember seeing it as a kid, and it was frightening. And because he didn't show anything, he didn't show much of the shark and the music, of course. You know.
And here's the other great little tidbit. We only see the full shark for 4 minutes in that film.
Right.
Like, how amazing is that? Because in your mind, you think you've seen it for the whole film, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Very convincing. And it could have been a very costly mistake, but instead it wasn't.
I could have ended his career.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the one that stood out for you.
Yeah, that was the one that I wrote first. And it was the one that's very indicative of the book, because that was a kind of a catastrophic mistake to happen to a young director. And in the middle of all of that, he found the greatest opportunity to make it one of the greatest films of all time.
Yeah. So when I was reading your book, one of my favorite stories was the Ellen DeGeneres story. I found it very moving, actually. I teared up at the end of it. What I found so interesting was she took such a risk by coming out as gay, but she knew deep down inside of herself that she had to stay true to herself.
Yeah.
And you recognized her talent when she was just a shy young actor. You actually met her, and she was involved in the filming of, was it a Labatt commercial? Or?
Yeah, I'd like to tell that story because it's such a great little story. So I was directing a big Labatt's beer campaign, and it's hard to find actors for beer campaigns because beer advertising is very prevalent. If someone does a commercial for Labatt, they can't do one for Molson because they have a conflict. So a lot of great actors get tied up with brands. So when you have a campaign to do, it's hard to find great actors. That was the situation when I was doing that campaign. So I suggested to Labatt that we record the spots down in Los Angeles because the great talent pool, and if someone has done an American beer, it doesn't matter because it would never air in Canada, so to speak. So there were no conflicts. So I needed about 5 or 6 or 7 great actors. My favorite actors in Hollywood, by the way, which I hired a lot, were always the great sitcom Second Bananas. They were my favorite actors because they were not expensive. They were smart and funny and professional. So I always loved to hire the great sitcom actors. But I needed, for this campaign, a young mid-20-something actress who was really funny because she had a lot of funny lines. So I did a big audition down in Los Angeles. And when I listened to the audition tapes, one actor just was hilarious. Every time she said the line, she nailed it. It was hilarious. Her attitude was hysterical. So I hired her on the spot. I never heard of her before. So I got down to LA and I had all these wonderful actors in the studio, and they all knew each other because they all know each other down there, except for this actress. She clearly didn't know anybody in the room because she was new to voiceover work. She was incredibly shy. She would recede back into the corner and she would just like disappear into the corner. And then when it was her time to deliver a line, she'd, walk up to the microphone, deliver her line, hilarious, and then just back away again into the corner, like so shy. And that actress, of course, was Ellen DeGeneres. So she was, as I say in the book, she was a star before she was a star.
Yes. Yeah. So can you tell us maybe a little bit more about her story and what happened there with her and her mistake? That really wasn't a mistake. It was something, she was being true to herself.
Yeah. Well, she had a sitcom, as everybody may remember. It wasn't doing well in the ratings. So her producers and some people on her show started talking to her about maybe having her character come out of the closet on the show. And that was a big decision for Ellen because context is important here. In that era, there was no leading actors of sitcoms that were gay. That had not been done before. And she knew she was risking a lot because, it was a topic that advertisers at that time were afraid of. If you start to lose advertisers on your show, the show will probably get canceled. You'll start losing viewers. So she decided to do it because, as you said, she wanted to be true to herself and she wanted to be authentic and not hide this side of her. So she did come out in that famous episode with Laura Dern in that great scene in the airport where Ellen leans over into the microphone and says, "I'm gay," and it goes across the entire airport. And Oprah was in that episode as her therapist, if you remember.
Yes.
And then, of course, the worst thing happened, which was advertisers peeled off the show. A lot of major groups in the US were threatened to boycott all the advertisers if they kept advertising inside Ellen's show. So the worst happened. Her worst fears manifested themselves in that she lost her show. Eventually, the show got canceled. Then she started getting a lot of abuse on the street. She had a couple of violent things happen on the street, and people started making fun of her. Even late night talk show hosts that loved having her on. Prior to that, now she was comedic fodder. She was so devastated by the response to that episode and losing her show that she left Hollywood. I mean, she literally moved to Ohio and lived there for like a year or whatever, just to get away from Hollywood, just to try and find herself, to center herself. And in that moment, she felt it was the biggest mistake of her career. Not my words, Ellen's words, and thought she had thrown it all away. And then, of course, she gets hired to do Finding Nemo, just to do a voiceover in that animated cartoon. That was her first little way back into her career. And then she started doing stand-up shows. She got a great manager who said, let's invite TV station affiliates to come and watch your stand-up so they can see how popular you still are. So they would have all these TV, station owners across the US in the audience just to see how funny she was and how much people still loved her. And then she ended up, of course, getting her afternoon talk show, which was the best thing that ever happened to her. So again, what she thought was a catastrophic career mistake ended up being the best thing that ever happened to her. And she's like, even she said, even when she admitted to the world she was gay, even her skin cleared up. Like she had an ongoing skin, like it was just so much shedding of so much shame and internal turmoil that just lifted off her shoulders. So a pretty wonderful story at the end of the day.
Yeah, releasing that internal turmoil, as you say, I think.
Yeah.
Sounds like, I mean, that was the best thing she could have done, really.
Yeah.
And you mentioned at the end of the story that President Obama provided her with an award. Is that
Yeah, she got I think it's the Medal of Freedom. Is that what that I believe that's
yes,
called?
that's what you said. Yeah.
Which is a huge honor because very few people get that. I think maybe a half a dozen people get it every year from the president. So he gave it to Ellen in that ceremony with a few other people got one too. But he said very lovely things about her courage to come out. And now, I mean, since then, Will and Grace and like all these big shows with leading gay characters is just, we just all accept that now. And really, she was the pioneer. She broke the path for everybody. So he gave a beautiful speech about her that day.
Yeah, she led the way there.
Yeah.
Actually, I've got a question here from Catherine related to the last two stories you talked about. She was wondering if you actually interviewed Steven Spielberg and Ellen yourself, or did you just do research?
I talked to some people and not to others. So the great thing about Spielberg and Ellen, those two stories, are there's a lot of great research out there about it because they were so widely covered. So there was a lot of research in this book. Being that this is the first non-marketing book I've written, it was a whole new world for me. But it was also tougher because almost every sentence had to be researched, as opposed to a marketing book where I can just free flow and just talk about marketing and my philosophies about it. This was really sentence by sentence had to be researched. So a lot of it came from really, really in-depth research.
And that really shines through in your writing too. You write very well, and you can tell, like it's like you're in the room with these people.
Yeah.
You know, the way you explain it, the conversations that go on between people.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
So you do talk a lot about, or a bit about, besides actors, you talk about musicians too. I think you have a real interest there, and you had some really interesting stories around people like Billy Joel, the Dixie Chicks, and their "Shut Up and Sing" biopic, and the Who, the guitars, and then Sam Phillips. And I actually listened to that song that was recorded that you talked about, where there was that fault in the because they dropped the amplifier. That's right. Yeah, that's
a great story too, because so Sam Phillips founded Sun Records in Memphis, as everybody knows, very famous recording studio, and he offered to record Ike Turner's band called the Kings of Rhythm. Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm. So he told them they had to be in Memphis the next morning, and they lived about 300 miles away. So they packed all their equipment into a car. So the bass drums on the roof, strapped to the roof, all their guitars and instruments. And the lead guitarist was putting his amplifier in the trunk, and he dropped it by mistake, and it hit the pavement, and it greatly damaged the cone inside the amplifier. But they had no time to find a new one, and nothing was open to buy a new one. So they threw it in the trunk and drove to Memphis. They get to Sam's studio. He asks them, to play some of their songs they've been writing. They play one song called Rocket 88. And it's the first time the guitarist plays on the song, and he plugs his guitar into the amp that he dropped, and the sound that comes out of the amp is weird, like it's distorted and odd. And they start apologizing for the sound of the amp. And Sam Phillips says, "Wait, I love that sound. I have never heard that sound before." So they record this song, Rocket 88, with this broken amp and this weird guitar sound. And Sam Phillips puts it out and it becomes this huge hit. But here's the important thing about that mistake. That is, historians collectively agree, most historians, that that was the very first rock and roll record, 1951, predated Elvis by 3 years. So that record, that milestone record, produced by Sam Phillips, all because, and put out as a record, all because he was infatuated with the sound of the broken amp, which was, of course, the mistake of the guitarist dropping it on the pavement on the way to the studio. Just a fantastic story.
It is it's a quirk or a fluke that happened. Yeah, and they turned it into something incredible, really, with that.
Well, it was a broken amp meeting the right guy. Sam Phillips was driven to find fresh sounds. That was always his thing. Like he had no patience for just routine songs. He always wanted to find an unusual singer, an unusual personality, an unusual the sound of the music. So that was a great fortuitous meeting of a broken amp and somebody with vision.
Exactly. Yeah. So then there was the Billy Joel story. I think it's very different from the Sam Phillips story because it's I don't know, it's a personal story of what happened to him and what he experienced and how it inspired him to write The Piano Man.
Yeah. So he did what so many recording artists do. He signed a bad record contract. And I mean, the music business is littered with those stories where, an artist is just so anxious to get a career going, to get a recording contract, and they sign away everything, the rights, the royalties, everything. He did that. So he was living in New York. The guy he signed with was living in LA. This guy owed Billy some money for touring, which wasn't forthcoming. So Billy decided he was going to move to LA because it would be easier to chase that money if he was in the same city as this record guy, this record executive. So he quietly went to LA, hired a Los Angeles lawyer, then started the quiet hunt for his money. And he also, while he was in LA, he had to earn some money because he had a wife and she had a child. She had a child from a previous marriage. So he had to find a job to support the three of them. And the only thing he knew he could do well was play piano. So he found a job at a real hole in the wall lounge called the Executive Room in LA, which no longer exists. And he would play there under the pseudonym of Bill Martin, not Billy Joel, because he didn't want the record company to know he was there for two reasons. One, because he was chasing his own money, but he also didn't want them to take part of his wages because he was under contract to them. So while he was in this bar every night playing songs for the patrons, he observed all the regulars. There was the bartender and the guy that's in the Navy, and the waitress practicing politics was his wife Elizabeth, who was also working as a waitress in the bar. So unlike most other recording artists who sign bad record contracts, then go through litigation and expensive lawyers and come away with nothing but bitterness, Billy Joel ended up writing his opus, ended up writing the biggest song of his career, the song he will be remembered. It'll be the first line of his obituary, guaranteed, that he was the author of Piano Man. So that whole mistake of signing the bad record contract, going to LA, trying to find his money, ended up with him writing the biggest song of his career.
Yeah, even he was inspired by those around him in the pub. Yeah.
Yeah.
So very, very humble beginnings in a way for that song. I mean, that's why it moves people, I think, too.
Such a great song. The lyrics are so great, and I never get tired of listening to that song. There's something magical about his descriptions of those people in that bar.
Yeah. So it looks like we've got a few questions here from the audience. So which are quite good. So I'm going to intersperse those
Yeah.
here, Terry. And this one is one that I had as well. Can you tell us about an idea that didn't make it into your book, that one that didn't make the cut?
I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that I had a criterion for the book, which was it had to be a mistake. There are a lot of interesting stories, especially around products, where something was accidental. In other words, it wasn't a mistake. It was just like, for example, maybe an example of that would be somebody was working on radar in I think it's World War II, and he was working on that as a piece of machinery, a radar, and the technician had a chocolate bar in his pocket. And whenever he turned this radar machine on, that the chocolate bar would melt in his pocket. And he started realizing that every time that happened, the chocolate bar he kept in his pocket for a snack would melt. And that, of course, became the radar range, which became the microwave. So that story I researched, but then it didn't make the cut for me because it was an accidental thing. He didn't make a mistake. He didn't make a decision. Something just, accidentally happened. So that kind of story didn't make the cut.
Okay, good to know. Do you have a story about a best mistake that's Canadian?
Did I include one in the book? Well, I did. I talked about, let me think if that is Canadian. It might be American too. I have a story about fiberglass pink home insulation in the book because I worked on fiberglass home insulation. I did all their advertising through the 80s. A lot of very funny TV commercials. There was a point in time where all fiberglass, all home insulation was the same color. It was white. So fiberglass wanted to stand out in the marketplace. So they decided to dye their fiberglass red because their logo was red. Red was just the color that they had built their branding around. So they took a big, like a whole shipment of fiberglass and put it through this dyeing process, and it came out the other end pink. And they were mortified because their market was contractors, like big burly guys, and pink, it was traditionally not a very masculine color. So they sold this insulation because they made so much of it, and apologized to all the contractors saying, sorry, this was meant to be red. We're going to correct it on the next batch that we manufacture. And they got the most surprising response back from contractors saying, we love it. We want more of the pink stuff. The pink stuff is great. And fiberglass just couldn't believe what they were hearing. So they stuck with it. Pink became their thing in the marketplace. And when I was doing the advertising for it, we did a lot of very funny commercials. Some folks may remember them from the 80s. We did one where people saved enough money by insulating to buy 262 beautiful pink flamingos, or they saved enough to make a totally tiny little pool in their backyard. But what was interesting was that the pink became the thing we used. We did pink print ads. I did pink themed radio commercials. We did pink themed television commercials. The Pink Panther became their mascot. Like it all. And when we were working on it, by the way, Julia, in the 80s, there was a point where fiberglass pink had over 70% of the insulation market. Like that's huge. Like I can't almost think of another brand that would ever have that kind of dominance in a market in a single category. Mm-hmm. And was really because all insulation was more or less the same. I mean, it all kind of worked well. So the only thing that made it different was its branding. And that all came out of the color pink. That's how powerful that mistake was, that it became the next 50 years became all about being pink.
And it was trademarked, right?
That's right. It was the first color given a trademark, because you couldn't trademark colors prior to that, but the courts allowed it because fiberglass proved that pink was an integral part of their product, and they had to go in front of the courts and a judge and prove that. And it was the first color awarded a trademark. And then since then, there's been many colors. You can't own a color. You can own a color attached to a product. So you know how Louboutin, beautiful women's shoes with the red soles, they can trademark that particular Pantone color of red for shoes, because nobody can own red, right? But they broke ground there by getting the trademark.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great story, and a Canadian story
Yeah.
too. That's, yeah. Thank you for that. Got another question here. I'll read it all to you, just so you can kind of get the context. It's quite an interesting question. Your philosophies and approach to marketing have fascinated me for years, and he's listened to your episodes, and he's a huge fan of We Regret to Inform You.
Mm.
I guess my question is, you work very closely with your family in the production of your podcasts, and I can only assume they are integral parts of your agency. So have you ever had any regrets or made any mistakes involving those that are closest to you? Or have you found that this has made the creative process and impact of your efforts even greater?
All good. So I don't have an agency anymore. What we have is a podcast company. It's called the Apostrophe Podcast Company. So it's a family business. So my wife is a producer. One of my daughters is a director, and my other daughter is a host and writer. So We Regret to Inform You is my daughter Sydney's show. So we have a podcast company that produces podcasts, and we have a podcast network where we have our own homegrown podcasts, and then we have other podcasts from outside that we host and market, etc. So the Canadian Star System, hosted by Steve Patterson of the Debaters fame, is on our network. Les Stroud, the Survivor Man, if there's any fans of his TV show, he has a podcast. We have another wonderful podcast about loneliness in the pandemic called Alone Together. So that is a family business, and I have no regrets whatsoever. It has been a great way to spend a lot more time with my family, and I can't think of a better thing in the world.
Yeah, that's your whole industry there, really. Yeah.
Yep.
Everybody has those abilities. You all obviously work very well together.
Everybody has a superpower, right, Julia? And all my family have a superpower, as everybody does. And it was just such a great fit for all of us because, I'm a writer, Callie's a director, Debbie's a great producer. Like, it was just a really great coming together of complementary skill sets.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for that response, that answer. I'll take a couple more here, and then I'll go back to some of the other questions I had. And actually, this one was one I had as well. And it's, what is your best personal mistake?
Do you have my book in front of you, Julia?
I do.
Read the dedication.
Yes. Dedicated to the worst boss I ever had, who taught me the best lesson, how not to do it.
So there it is. So in my, before I started my own company, which was in 1989, I had a succession of jobs. One of those jobs was terrible, where the boss really didn't like my work. Every time I presented an idea, he turned it down. Nothing about it was good. It wasn't a great place to work. And at the time, I thought I'd made a horrible mistake joining that company. I thought I just wasted, I was there for about 18 months. I thought I just wasted 18 months of my career here, and always regretted it. Then when I started my company in 1989, I realized very quickly that my time spent at that other place was like gold, because I learned how not to do it there. So in other words, I could do the opposite with my company. I knew how to inspire creative people because I never felt inspired at that other company. I knew what I wanted to hear from my boss that he never gave me. So I gave that to our creative people, and how to run a company and how to care about your clients, which really didn't happen at that other firm. So in hindsight, it really gave me a great footing and a great ongoing operating philosophy that at the time I thought I was just in the worst job in the world. And then in hindsight, it was an absolute golden set of rules and lessons that I could bring to my own company.
Well, yeah, I think you're the type of person who would really see that and appreciate that for what it is, instead of thinking of it as a regret, really.
At the time, I had a really hard time appreciating it, but years later, I really did.
Yeah. Yeah. So I am going to go back to another question I had. I really like how you talk about people's early beginnings and their families, and where they were born, and how these things, these factors actually play a role in who they become. Two that really stood out for me were Joseph Armand Bombardier, who is Canadian,
Yeah.
and Mario Puzo,
Yes.
who's an author, very famous American author. Can you tell us a bit about those stories?
So Bombardier, that is a Canadian story. He lived in rural Quebec, and he was a tinkerer. Like, he was a mechanic that loved to tinker with automobiles and mechanized equipment. He was gifted at it. The problem that he and his fellow townspeople faced in rural Quebec at that time, we're talking probably the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, was in the wintertime, they were stranded. They were marooned. There was so much snow. There was no snow plows. There was no way to get out of town. Like, if you had to leave town to do, you couldn't. Everybody was stuck in town for the deep part of winter. So he was trying to develop the snowmobile. He thought if he could invent some kind of piece of equipment that could cut through the snow or float above the snow, that it would be just so a necessary and wonderful piece of equipment he could give to people that lived rurally. While he was working on it, he had a family, and he had a young son, and his young son got very, very ill, and they couldn't get him to hospital because of the snow. And the hospital, I think, was only 10 miles away, maybe, I say in the book, from where he lived, and he couldn't get there, and his young son died. And in his garage was a half-finished snowmobile. So he, devastated with the loss of his son, he just redoubled his efforts to try and make that snowmobile work. He had a lot of iterations that didn't work. And then he finally cracked it. He finally figured out how to create a snowmobile that could work in thick snow, light snow, deep snow. It was just a great, all of it came together for him at one point in 1959, I think it was. And then the great part of that story was he was ready to manufacture it. He had all his marketing promotion printed up, all the brochures, etc. When he looked at the brochures that he had printed up, he wanted to call the snowmobile the Ski Dog, because it was kind of like a mechanical dog sled. But when he looked at the brochure, there was a typo. And instead of Ski Dog, it said Ski Doo. The O had changed the G had changed to an O. The typesetter had made a mistake. And he stared at it. And instead of being furious, because it was all printed and paid for, he went, I like that name. There's something about that name I like. He said, it feels fast. It feels like skedaddle, skidoo. And he said, more than that, I can trademark it, because it was such a weird word. You probably couldn't trademark Ski Dog, but Skidoo he could. So that was really how that wonderful brand came to be, was the result of a printing error. And Armand Bombardier invented the first great snowmobile.
So we have him to thank for one of our favorite pastimes up here in Muskoka.
That's right. That's exactly right. And who was this? The second person you mentioned was?
Mario Puzo.
Mario Puzo. I'm a huge Godfather fan, Julia. I just love even Godfather 3. I'll take it. I'll take all of the Godfather movies. My wife and I watch the whole trilogy at least once a year. Mario Puzo, in his own words, and I quote this in the chapter, he says, I am a chooch. And he said, the definition of a chooch is that person in your family who never gets their act together, who never really gets their career going, never really holds down a steady job, that, your siblings and your parents are constantly having to send you money. He said, I was that guy. I was the chooch of my family. He wanted to be a serious writer. He wrote 2 novels that really didn't do anything. I think he made $3,000 in total royalties from both of them. But he was also a gambler. So he had a big gambling habit. So he would borrow money from his friends and from his siblings to pay off his gambling debts. And then he got in kind of deep on his gambling debts, and he made this huge mistake. And the mistake was, for the first time, he borrowed money from loan sharks. And loan sharks aren't as forgiving as a family member is. So he owed big money by a certain date, or he said to somebody in the story that they would break his arm. So he needed to write a quick book to get advance money. All he was interested in was to get advance money so he could cover that loan shark debt. So he just came up with an idea about a story about the mafia. And he didn't know anybody in the mafia. He just literally just kind of wrote it, and he just wrote an outline, presented it to his publisher. They weren't interested because they didn't have any faith in him as a writer after his first 2 novels failed. A friend of his brought them in to see his publisher. They kind of did like it, and they gave him a $5,000 advance. And that's what he needed to cover the loan shark debt. So he took the money, paid off the debt, and then realized he had to write a book. There was that part of it, that part of the deal. So he literally dashed it off, Julia. And in hindsight, he says it was not good writing. He wished he'd spent more time on it. It was really a cash grab. And then while he was writing it, he went down to Hollywood to see if he could sell the movie rights and get a little more money. And he had a meeting with Robert Evans, the famous movie producer down there, who wasn't that crazy about the story, but he was a gambler too. So he understood the predicament that Puzo was in with the loan sharks. And he said, I'll buy the movie rights for $12,500. And Puzo said, deal, done. So he got $5,000 from the publisher, $12,500 from the movie studio. And doesn't the book, The Godfather, became one of the biggest bestsellers of all time? Doesn't the movie become one of the greatest movies of all time, which was a steal for Paramount at $12,500 because they had paid $1 million for Jacqueline Suzanne's novel that year. So you can imagine what a bargain The Godfather was, but all because of the mistake of borrowing money from loan sharks led to the creation of The Godfather.
And wasn't he consulted on when the movie was being made?
Oh, yes.
That in your book too, that he was consulted, Puzo was consulted on that.
Yeah, he wrote the screenplay with Coppola.
Yeah. Which doesn't always happen.
No, usually a writer is kind of very, very quickly out of the picture. But yeah, they kept him on board, and he ended up collaborating with Coppola on all 3 Godfather films.
Oh wow, that's great. I love that story.
Yeah, that's a great story about a really terrible decision turning into the best thing that ever happened to him. Because he eventually, of course, made millions and millions and millions of dollars. Even though he had a small little piece of the action, there was just so much money rolling in. The Godfather stayed on bestseller lists for years. So he was a wealthy man after that.
Yeah. Right. Well, I'm going to ask another question that somebody from the audience has asked. And this one's specific to you. It's from Pam. Terry, she's asking, were you always a curious sort? Someone who needs to know, even as a child, she's wondering if you had that.
I would say yes. I would say I've always been curious. Always, as far back as I can remember. They always wanted to know more about something, why something is this way. Does it have to be this way? What's the history of that? I love history. So I would say that has been part of me for as long as I can remember. No doubt about it.
Yeah, and certainly something that you see. I mean, in order for you to do the type of research you've done for this book, you had to be curious, right? You had to know more about these stories.
No, exactly right. And a lot of the stories I kind of knew about the mistake, but I didn't know the circumstances of the mistake. So the research was a joy because it just fed my curiosity. It was just a win-win for me.
So Maureen's asking, how did you identify potential stories for research?
Really, I am a consummate story hunter. So I am always hunting for stories, Julia. So I have copious notes. Every book I read, I make notes on it. And even if I have a pre-pandemic, I have a very busy speaking career where I'll give keynote talks across the country. And even when people come up to me after and just chatting to me after my talk and they tell me a great story, I'll right after that, I'm done. I'll go up to my hotel room and write that story down in an email and send it to myself. And then I'll file it in a certain way that I can cross-reference it. So I'm always looking for stories. So a lot of the stories, if not all, almost all of them, I had tucked into my files as potential interesting things to go after one day. Like even, someone may tell me a story at a speech, and I may not use that story for 5 years. But when I do use that story, Julia, it is the perfect story for that episode or the perfect story for my book. Somebody had emailed me years ago who had worked for Skidoo and told me that story. And I want to say they told me that story probably in 2006. So I've been sitting on that story looking for a place for it since then. And the book was the perfect place to tell that story. So that was a prime example of that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the fact that you record the stories as soon as you hear them, send them off yourself in an email with all the details, so then you don't forget it. That's a really great way of doing research.
Yeah, and with computers too, it's with the find function. I mean, you can, like, I have thousands of pages of notes from books and stories that I've collected, but I mean, I can just, I could, Command F mistake, and then all my mistake stories. I mean, it's what a time to live. What an era that we live in, right?
So true. I'm going to take one more question from the audience here, and then I'll go back to some of the others we had. This person is wondering, what advice or thoughts would you share with young entrepreneurs who some days aren't sure if the adventure they are on is their biggest or best mistake? By the way, we binge listen to the podcast while we're working away late at night.
Well, I've been an entrepreneur since I was 29. So it has been the majority of my life. It's a funny thing about being an entrepreneur. Malcolm Gladwell has an interesting theory. His theory is this. He said, what the thing that entrepreneurs share in common is not an appetite for risk, which has really been the conventional thinking on that. He says it's that they're sure they're onto a sure thing, that they're convinced they're onto a sure thing. And when I think back on how I felt when I started my company in 1989, I felt I was onto a sure thing. I created the company I could not find. So as a writer in the advertising world, after you've written a script, television or radio, and the client approves that script, the next part of the process is you hire a production company with a director, and the director directs your TV commercial, or the director directs your radio commercials. And I worked with directors in Toronto, Vancouver, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, all over North America. And I always had the same experience, which was I ended up fighting to save my work from the director. So instead of the director plussing my work or making it better, they would destroy my work or dismantle it or concentrate on the humor and forget about the sell. And I was just so frustrated with that, constantly paying them big money, that one day I had that fist slam moment that all entrepreneurs have and say, there's got to be a better way. So that led to the creation of Pirate Radio. It began as a radio company because I created the company I could not find, which was a company that protected ideas, that directed ideas from a writer's point of view, because I was a writer and I understood what it took to get a script to the point where it needed production, that it had survived a whole gauntlet of approvals. And now it was my job to really protect it and then, express that idea. So that's where that was the genesis of Pirate Radio, which then of course became Pirate Radio and Television. But I think, just to answer that question, I think in your heart of hearts how passionate you are about it. And if you're really passionate about it, you will make it work. It'll happen for you. If you don't feel that passion, I think it's not that your idea is good, but your passion won't see it through the tough times. And startup is tough because you're putting out a lot of money, don't have a lot of revenue coming in, you're battling bigger, more established competitors till you get established. Like, it's a very, very tough time. Most companies don't survive past 3 years. A lot of companies close their doors before the 3-year mark. So I think the passion is the key.
So if you can get past the risk taking by having that passion, then you're more likely to be successful.
Yeah, because then risks become calculated risks. Because then you can say, I'm going to spend money on this, but I know you have to spend money to make money. So I'm okay with that. Like you'll make those decisions as you go.
Right. So this is sort of a similar question, but it relates to nonfiction writing. And I was wondering if you had any advice for somebody who is interested in writing nonfiction, and what that would be, because you've done quite a bit of it for sure.
Well, I'm a huge nonfiction fan. I would say almost all of I have an extensive book library, and I'd say almost all of them are nonfiction. Just a thing I love. What would I say about that? I mean, our radio show is a nonfiction show, of course. You can be a storyteller and work in the nonfiction world. You don't have to only be in the fiction world, because really, if you think about the radio show Under the Influence, it's storytelling, and even a nonfiction story that you can tell a great story. In other words, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's tension, there's surprise, there's an aha moment, which I always love to find in every story I tackle. I mean, there's those moments in this book. I always try and make each of the stories I tell on the radio show that they have this moment where all the things come together and you go, I got it, or wow, I can't believe that happened. So I think the interesting thing is, just to recoup this, that nonfiction has a lot of the same ingredients as fiction, that there's a storytelling arc to be had.
Yeah, there really is. Yeah, and you do see that in all of the stories that you've put down. Yeah,
it's not just facts. I mean, bad nonfiction would just be facts.
Yeah, exactly.
But great nonfiction is a story.
Yeah. So, story about the front cover. How was the book cover developed? The art for the book cover.
I love that book cover, by the way. I think it just summed up that the core of the book so brilliantly. So I said to my editor, Brad Wilson, my wonderful editor at HarperCollins, I said, when we talked about the cover art, he said, what are you thinking? I said, give me an idea, not a design. That was really the big thing I said to him. I said, don't give me a design, give me an idea, because I'm an idea person. Yeah. So he went away, talked to his wonderful designers and art directors at HarperCollins. And when he was ready to present some ideas, he said, I've got 4 ideas, but there's one that's the one. And I'm really picky when it comes to book covers, so I'm really hard to please in that department. And he showed me this book cover, and I instantly loved it, because the very idea of erasing biggest and just leaving B-E-S-T there was exactly the kernel in every chapter. Was someone made the biggest mistake of their life and ended up being the best thing ever. It was so perfect that I loved it. And the artist's name was David G. And here's the great part of that story. So he designed this cover. I used to work with him. He was an advertising writer for years. So David and I we created many campaigns over the years. And as a side hustle, he's a book designer. So we had it our paths crossed yet again. So it was pretty wonderful.
Oh, that's neat. That's a neat backstory too. Yeah. You had a connection with him.
Yeah.
So we have about 5 minutes left or so. So I think we'll start to wrap things up. I've got just a couple more questions. In terms of the book itself, what would you say linked all of these very different, very diverse stories together?
That's a really great question. Even though those stories feel very different, because as you said, there's athletes, musicians, inventors, performers, it's all different walks of life. There was connective tissue between all those stories. And it was this, that when the big mistake was made, or the small mistake was made, whatever it was in each case, and in particular the big ones, the people didn't run away. They didn't just, collapse and be devastated and disappear, as so many people do. They just kind of put their tail between their legs and you never hear from them again. They stuck with it. They worked their way through the pain of the mistake. And the last chapter in the book is about this wonderful surgeon who feels there's too many mistakes being made in operating rooms around the world. And even in the US, more people were dying because of surgical mistakes done, post-operative problems. 3 times, I think it was, the amount of people who die in car accidents in the US. He said, this has got to stop. So he ended up making a checklist that surgeons should follow in the operating room. And he based it on the checklist that pilots use. So when something mechanically goes wrong in a plane, the pilot pulls out this checklist to go through so he can systematically tackle the problem while he's in midair. And the first item on that checklist is fly the plane. Because pilots get so caught up in solving the problem that they forget to fly the plane. That was what all the chapters had in common. They all kept flying the plane. Billy Joel stuck with it. Ellen, came back to Hollywood. Fiberglass didn't, turn their fiberglass red. They stuck with pink. Everybody embraced the obstacle. Because what I've learned through my career over and over and over again is that the solution to every major problem is sitting at the heart of the solution is sitting at the heart of the problem. So you have to almost peel the problem like a banana, because sitting at the center of that problem is the opportunity. And that the big takeaway of this book is that inside every huge mistake is a hidden gift. You just have to look for it.
I love that. The hidden gift.
The hidden gift. Look, think of Spielberg,
Mhm.
where the hidden gift was exactly at the heart of the problem, which was like, my shark won't work, so I won't show him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Find another solution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love the tenacity of the folks that are in these stories, right? Like you said, they stuck with it.
They stuck with it.
Flying that plane. That's a great analogy.
I kept flying the plane. Yeah, which is the big insight for me writing this, seeing that come up over and over again. They kept flying their plane.
Yeah. Great. Well, Terry, I do want to ask you what's next for you. You're sitting in your Airstream recording studio. For those who are not aware of that, I think that's so cool. At your home. And so what's next for you in terms of both your writing and your radio show?
We are back on the air in January. We're a January to June show every year. So we are starting our 17th season on CBC in January, which is astounding when I say that out loud. I can't believe that, but here I am 17 years into this. So that starts up where I'm writing episodes right now. I'm just about to start the 3rd episode of the season. I try and get about 8 episodes written and recorded before I hit the air in January, because I need a lot of runway room, because research is the toughest part of the show. Coming up with the themes is the easiest part of the show, and doing the research is the toughest part of the show. Depending on the theme, Julia, I would say there's between 20 to 30 to 35 hours of research goes into every 27-minute episode.
Wow.
It's a huge undertaking.
Oh,
so yeah, that's why I need a lot of runway. I have great researchers to help me, but yeah, it takes a lot of research to put on that show. It's Under the Influence is an ambitious show. There's no doubt about that, because it may take 30 hours of research. It takes me 3 days to go through all the research I get back from my researchers. I'll get 100 pages of research back from them, and it takes me 3 days to wade my way through it and then decide what the show is in my mind. And then it takes me another 2.5 days to write it. And then it takes about 10 to 12 hours in the studio to produce a 27-minute show, because there's a lot of elements in my show. There's music and clips and voiceover and actors and sound effects. And so it's a big undertaking. So anyway, that all starts in January. We have our podcast company, Apostrophe Podcast, as I spoke earlier, which is very busy right now, which we love. It's going really well. And then I'll start another book down the road a little bit. I've got a couple of things that I'm kicking around, but there'll be another book maybe in about a year, I'll start that. I'll start the next one.
Great. So we can look
Yeah.
forward to that
Yeah.
in the future. Yeah, that's super. Well, Terry, I'm going to just do a bit of a wrap up. Thank you so much for being a part of our series, and we, highly recommend people pick up Terry's book. Thanks also to HarperCollins, which is the publisher of the book. Thanks to Alexandria Taylor at the Ontario Public Library Service, for without her assistance, we wouldn't have the technical webinar Zoom platform available to us. So that's great. And thanks to all of you for listening in and for your great questions. Really appreciate those. For those of you who want to buy a copy of My Best Mistake, you can do that, at local booksellers, of course, but you can also purchase it through the libraries in Muskoka. And if you want to do that, just contact us by noon tomorrow, because we're still taking orders for it. And just a reminder that tonight's presentation has been recorded and it will be available on our websites. So yeah, so thank you so much, Terry. I really enjoyed our conversation. And more questions, of course, but people will have to pick up the book.
Well, thanks for having me, Julia. I really enjoyed this conversation. Great questions from the viewers. Really, really terrific questions. I enjoyed that. Thanks for having me.
Too. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.